The breaking news from the front lines. Ukraine held its silence, waiting with precision and patience. The Russian Shadow Fleet, worth over 200 million, moved confidently into the main port, thinking the waters were theirs to rule. But in that critical hour, the trap was sprung. With unshakable resolve and iron strategy, 3,000 kilograms of explosive fury came crashing down, turning the night sky into fire and steel. What was meant to be Moscow's display of dominance became its most staggering loss at sea. Ukraine's patience and timing turned Russia's 200M Shadow Fleet into a floating trap, a move that would go down as one of the most audacious and strategically calculated maneuvers of modern warfare. For weeks, intelligence networks had been carefully monitoring the build-up of Russian naval power, shadow ships that were designed to project dominance, frighten opponents, and safeguard critical supply lines. The Kremlin had invested heavily in these vessels, equipping them with advanced radar systems, electronic warfare suites, and a degree of stealth capability that was meant to ensure near invisibility against conventional detection. Yet, no amount of technology could substitute for the underestimation of an opponent's resolve, and Ukraine knew that timing, not force alone, would be the decisive factor. Rather than rushing into a direct clash, Ukraine employed a tactic deeply rooted in patience. Surveillance drones hovered quietly above contested waters, feeding real-time data back to command centers. Signals intelligence captured the rhythm of Russian movements, the repetition of their supply routes, and the confidence that grew inside the Russian high command as day after day passed without incident. This deliberate silence was not weakness, it was a calculated invitation. A theater of illusion where Ukraine masked its true intentions behind restraint. The Shadow Fleet believed the port would remain untouched, that its ships could dock, refuel, and resupply without threat. The Russians sailed into this comfort, blind to the storm building in silence. The trap was not a single event, but a culmination of layers upon layers of preparation. Ukrainian engineers had positioned strike drones and missile batteries at strategic intervals, waiting for the fleet to sail into a narrow corridor where escape would be difficult and defenses stretched thin. Reconnaissance aircraft circled high above international waters, just outside the reach of Russian anti-air capabilities, transmitting a continuous stream of coordinates. Naval strike groups rehearsed precision maneuvers, not to chase the fleet, but to box it into a geographic kill zone, where every movement would be predictable. Time was on Ukraine's side, and every passing day the Russians ventured deeper, convinced that the silence meant safety. The patience itself became a weapon. Russia's admirals, confident in their 200mm investment, failed to recognize that predictability breeds vulnerability. By waiting, Ukraine stripped Moscow of its advantage, forcing the fleet into patterns so fixed that even its stealth designs became irrelevant. The anticipation stretched like a bowstring pulled taut. The longer it held, the greater the force it could unleash. Ukrainian forces were not interested in small harassment strikes. They sought a decisive blow that would turn expensive assets into smoldering wreckage. A strike so powerful that the world would question Russia's command of the seas. When the fleet finally entered the main port, the moment Ukraine had waited for arrived. A barrage was prepared, not of small arms but of 3,000 kilograms of concentrated explosive might. Every kilogram carried not just destructive power, but symbolic weight, representing defiance, resilience, and a refusal to submit. The fleet, once thought untouchable, was suddenly within range of the most devastating strike Ukraine had ever prepared. As the night deepened, the roar of engines and the launch of precision munitions broke the silence. Explosions lit the horizon like rolling thunder, and within minutes, the Shadow Fleet was no longer a symbol of dominance, but a graveyard of steel and fire. The transformation from patience to decisive action stunned observers across the globe. Analysts who once questioned Ukraine's ability to withstand Russia's maritime pressure now saw proof that strategy outweighs brute strength. The patience that held the fleet in suspense was not hesitation but mastery, a lesson in restraint as a weapon of war. Russia's 200-ebon fleet, once a projection of power, became the very evidence of hubris, lured into a port where retreat was impossible and survival uncertain. Every move of this operation demonstrated the precision of Ukraine's planning. The silence of the weeks before the strike was as deliberate as the roar of the bombs that followed. It was not simply about destroying ships. It was about reshaping perceptions, altering the balance of psychological warfare, and proving that no investment, no matter how vast, guarantees safety against an opponent who knows how to wait. The floating trap was sprung, not with reckless urgency, but with the patience of hunters who stalk their prey until escape becomes an illusion. The patience of Ukraine's forces, their ability to disguise intent, and the timing of their final strike combined into an operation that will be studied by military strategists for decades. It was not just a matter of firepower, but of understanding when to unleash it. By allowing Russia's shadow fleet to believe it was untouchable, Ukraine created the conditions for its downfall. The destruction of the fleet was not a single night's work. It was weeks of silence, observation, and preparation, ending in a storm that turned steel into ruins and pride into ashes. The main port was struck with 3 Zalozhny bombs, igniting devastation Moscow never expected. What unfolded in that single strike was not just an act of destruction, but a turning point in the psychological and tactical dimensions of the war. Ports, by their very nature, are lifelines of naval power. They provide the arteries through which fleets receive fuel, supplies, and reinforcements. Russia had considered its main port a fortress, shielded by air defenses, naval patrols, and electronic jamming systems designed to repel any strike. The sheer weight of a 3,000 tonnage explosive, however, carried a force that no radar, no barrier, and no fortress could withstand once timing and precision aligned. Ukraine's choice of weaponry reflected an intent far beyond harassment. It was designed for annihilation, to send shockwaves that would resonate across the entire chain of Russian command. The bombs themselves represented an escalation in strategy, not just in scale but in symbolism. Where smaller strikes had previously been used to test defenses, this strike unleashed overwhelming mass, equivalent to tearing through layers of steel and concrete with a single devastating blow. The force shattered not just physical infrastructure, but the illusion of safety Russia had maintained around its critical hub. The port, thought untouchable, became a theater of fire and chaos as flames erupted across docking facilities, fuel depots, and communication lines. The magnitude of destruction stunned even seasoned observers. Images of black smoke rising from the port painted a picture of vulnerability no Russian narrative could conceal. In military history, ports have always been symbols of power projection. They serve as staging grounds for fleets, anchors of supply lines, and strategic assets around which entire campaigns revolve. To strike such a target is to strike the heart of naval capability itself. Ukraine's decision to focus the force of 3 Zalozhny bombs on this port was deliberate, a message to Moscow that no infrastructure, no matter how fortified, was beyond reach. The devastation that followed was more than tactical, it was psychological warfare, unraveling the myth of Russian invincibility in the very waters it sought to dominate. Commanders who once believed they controlled the tempo of naval operations were now forced to reckon with a reality in which their most secure port could be reduced to rubble in moments. The unexpected nature of the strike was as critical as its destructive power. Russian surveillance had failed to detect the buildup, misreading Ukraine's silence as inactivity. The sudden roar of detonation tore through the complacency of the defenders, leaving them scrambling to respond to a catastrophe they had not anticipated. Firefighting systems struggled to contain the inferno. Naval crews rushed to save ships moored too close to the blasts, and command communications descended into confusion. For Moscow, the shock was not only in the loss of material, but in the collapse of confidence. If a strike of this magnitude could reach the port once, the fear lingered that it could happen again. The 3,000 Q-1000 payload unleashed layers of cascading damage beyond the immediate craters and shattered infrastructure. Secondary explosions tore through fuel reserves, spreading fire across the port's logistics hubs. Ammunition depots lit up in violent bursts, amplifying the chaos and ensuring that containment was nearly impossible. The chain reaction magnified the devastation, turning what might have been a single strike into hours of relentless destruction. Every plume of smoke carried with it the reality that rebuilding such a facility would not be a matter of days or weeks but months, if not longer. For a nation relying on maritime supply chains, that loss was crippling. International observers watched closely, recognizing that the strike signified more than a local tactical gain. It demonstrated a shift in the balance of power, a revelation that Ukraine's capabilities had evolved to the point of striking deep, striking hard, and striking where it mattered most. Analysts highlighted the precision of the operation, pointing out that hitting such a heavily defended port required not just firepower, but flawless coordination. Each step of the operation underscored Ukraine's growing mastery of modern warfare tactics, from intelligence gathering to timing the assault, when defenses were at their weakest. For Russian sailors, the psychological toll was immeasurable. Ports are supposed to represent safety, a home to which fleets can retreat after long missions. To see that home engulfed in fire and shattered by explosions was to lose not just material confidence, but emotional assurance. Families of sailors stationed at the port faced uncertainty, while commanders struggled to restore morale among crews, suddenly aware that their sanctuary had been violated. Fear replaced confidence, hesitation replaced momentum, and doubt began to seep into the ranks of a fleet once paraded as untouchable. The devastation also rippled across Moscow's political landscape. A strike of this magnitude could not be easily concealed from its population or allies. The Kremlin, long invested in projecting strength, was forced to grapple with the reality of explaining how a 200 mem fleet and a fortified port could be reduced to burning wreckage despite their vaunted defenses. Propaganda narratives strained to minimize the scale of the disaster, yet images from satellites and eyewitness accounts told a story that could not be buried. The 3,000 Klajus bombs had not only shattered steel and stone, they had shattered illusions. Ukraine's message through this strike was unmistakable. Precision, patience, and overwhelming force had converged in a single act that exposed the fragility of Russian control. What Moscow never expected was not merely the scale of the destruction, but the timing, the audacity, and the confidence with which Ukraine delivered its blow. The port that once stood as a cornerstone of Russian naval strength now lay in ruins. And the devastation was a reminder to the world that no fortress is beyond reach when the weight of 3,000 kilograms of resolve comes crashing down. What was meant to show Russian strength became a symbol of vulnerability and loss. A dramatic reversal that exposed the cracks in Moscow's narrative of control. The deployment of the Shadow Fleet and the reliance on fortified ports were supposed to send a clear message of dominance, projecting an image of Russia as unyielding in its naval superiority. Every movement of those ships was staged as part of a theater of intimidation, designed not only to reassure Russia's own population, but also to intimidate Ukraine and its allies. The Kremlin had invested billions in cultivating an image of invincibility. Yet in a single night, the illusion collapsed. The strike that tore through the port with overwhelming force transformed what was once a show of power into a display of fragility. The symbolism of vulnerability carries a weight far greater than the loss of material assets. In warfare, perception often rivals reality. Moscow had long broadcast the image of an impregnable navy, boasting of stealth ships, advanced technology, and an unbreakable chain of command. The destruction of the fleet in port revealed that all of these assurances were hollow when faced with a patient, calculated adversary. The flames that engulfed the vessels were more than fire. They were a metaphor for a collapsing narrative, one that had convinced Russian citizens and the world that their navy stood beyond reach. Vulnerability replaces intimidation when power is stripped of its protective armor. And in this case, Russia's display of force was undone in the most public and humiliating way. For Ukraine, this transformation was not accidental but deliberate. By waiting, by striking at the precise moment when Russian forces least expected it, they shifted the theater of war from a contest of arms to a contest of perception. Ukraine understood that destroying ships was only part of the battle. What mattered equally was destroying the story Russia told about its navy. Every plume of smoke from the port undermined Russia's attempt to appear unshakable. The damage was not just physical but psychological, a reminder to Moscow's admirals and soldiers that their strength could be turned into weakness with the right strategy. Internationally, the symbolism reverberated just as powerfully. Allies and adversaries alike witnessed the vulnerability of Russia's naval operations. Nations that once hesitated to back Ukraine more strongly now had tangible proof of its capability to challenge Moscow in domains previously thought impossible. Global observers saw that a nation under siege could not only defend itself, but strike decisively at the heart of its opponent's strength. For Russia, this was the worst kind of loss. Not only did it weaken its fleet, but it also weakened its influence abroad, eroding the perception that supporting Ukraine was a losing cause. Vulnerability on the battlefield translated into vulnerability in diplomacy, with partners reconsidering their alignment in the shadow of such a public failure. The loss also struck deeply within Russia's internal structures. The Kremlin had relied on military spectacles to reinforce its narrative of strength at home, presenting its citizens with images of power and control. The destruction of a fleet meant to symbolize dominance turned those spectacles into symbols of waste and miscalculation. Citizens who were told their taxes and resources supported an unstoppable war machine were instead confronted with images of shattered vessels and burning ports. Every dollar, every ruble invested into projecting strength had gone up in flames, leaving only questions and doubts. Vulnerability replaced pride, and whispers of discontent echoed louder in the face of undeniable loss. The psychological toll on the Russian military itself was immense. Sailors, officers, and commanders who once believed their navy represented an unassailable pillar of national defense now faced the reality that their sanctuary could be penetrated, their ships destroyed, and their comrades lost in an instant. The belief in their own invulnerability was shattered, and with it came hesitation, fear, and doubt. When strength becomes weakness, morale falters, and hesitation on the battlefield can prove deadlier than any single weapon. The shadow of loss lingers in the minds of those asked to return to the same waters, knowing that what was once safe had become a graveyard. From a strategic perspective, the strike forced Moscow to reconsider its deployments, divert resources, and stretch defenses thin in places they once believed secure. This redirection of focus created opportunities for Ukraine, opening new avenues of engagement as Russia scrambled to recover from its symbolic defeat. What was once an asset became a liability, a fleet meant to intimidate, now serving as a cautionary tale. In military terms, a symbol of vulnerability is as dangerous as actual weakness, because it compels commanders to act defensively, to second-guess decisions, and to fear repeating mistakes. The broader historical context also adds depth to this transformation. Throughout history, empires have relied on grand symbols of strength to project power, only to see them crumble under the weight of unexpected blows. Russia's Shadow Fleet, touted as a demonstration of maritime might, now fits into this pattern. The 3,000 kju strike reduced years of investment and months of propaganda into a spectacle of loss, a modern reminder that no empire, no fleet, and no fortress is immune to reversal. What begins as strength can, under the pressure of strategy and patience, become a symbol of fragility remembered long after the smoke clears. For Ukraine, the victory was not merely tactical but cultural, an affirmation that resolve and intelligence can overcome wealth and equipment. For Russia, it was a revelation that the strength it so loudly proclaimed was built on assumptions too fragile to withstand reality. The destruction of the fleet in port will remain a symbol, not of what Russia wanted the world to see, but of what the world will remember: strength that became weakness, power that became vulnerability, and a display of dominance that collapsed into loss. The strike signals a turning tide. Ukraine's precision reshaping the course of the war in ways that go beyond the immediate battlefield. Every conflict has its defining moments, and this attack has emerged as one of them. A point where patience, planning, and execution converge to alter the trajectory of events. Wars are rarely won by numbers alone. They are shaped by momentum, by the perception of who holds the initiative, and by the ability to seize opportunities when they appear. Ukraine's decision to unleash a strike of such magnitude demonstrated not only technical capability, but also the ability to set the rhythm of the war, taking control of when and how the decisive blows would be delivered. The concept of a turning tide in war often rests on morale, both for the forces engaged and for the societies supporting them. For Ukraine, the success of this operation served as a rallying cry, proof that their fight was not only defensive but transformative. The precision of the strike became a testament to discipline and resolve, sending a surge of confidence through troops and civilians alike. The message was clear: Ukraine could strike deep, it could strike effectively, and it could turn what seemed like overwhelming Russian advantages into weaknesses. Each explosion at the port carried not just physical destruction, but also a signal to the Ukrainian people that their resilience was bearing fruit, that the tide of the war could indeed shift in their favor. For Russia, the strike carried the opposite effect. The sense of inevitability that its leadership had tried to cultivate, the narrative that time and attrition would eventually wear Ukraine down, was dealt a significant blow. When a fortified main port and a 2,000-man fleet can be destroyed in one decisive act, the aura of inevitability disappears. Moscow's forces were forced into a reactive posture, scrambling to protect assets once believed secure, diverting resources to defensive measures, and acknowledging vulnerabilities that had been publicly exposed. A tide turning against them does not only reduce material advantage, but eats away at confidence. Sowing hesitation in future decisions, and hesitation in warfare is often more damaging than any bomb. Internationally, the strike reshaped perceptions of the conflict's trajectory. Allies of Ukraine saw in the operation the tangible results of their support, evidence that training, intelligence sharing, and advanced systems placed in Ukrainian hands were making a decisive impact. What might have been viewed as a war of endurance suddenly appeared as a conflict where Ukraine could seize initiative and deliver blows that resonated globally. This turning tide encouraged greater backing, both militarily and politically, strengthening Ukraine's position on the world stage. At the same time, nations still weighing their alignment were forced to reconsider the image of Russian strength they had been shown. Vulnerability at the heart of Russia's naval operations revealed cracks in the image of a superpower, and with cracks comes the risk of losing influence. The precision of the operation also stands as a symbol of modern warfare's evolution. Rather than relying solely on massed firepower, Ukraine demonstrated the power of intelligence, timing, and coordination. The 3 Zolotaya bombs that struck the port were devastating, but it was their placement, their timing, and the orchestration behind them that magnified their effect. This kind of precision reshapes how wars are fought and how they are remembered. The strike was not just a tactical blow, but a demonstration of a doctrine in which patience and precision create results far greater than their material weight. Such lessons ripple far beyond the current conflict, influencing how other nations view their own strategies and vulnerabilities. The turning tide can also be seen in the shift of initiative. Until this moment, much of the war's narrative had been dominated by Russian offensives, Russian advances, and Russian attempts to dictate the terms of engagement. By striking so boldly at a main port, Ukraine took that initiative, showing that it could force Russia into a reactive state. The battlefield is not only terrain but time, and to control the tempo of war is to control its flow. By dictating when and where the decisive blow fell, Ukraine proved it could seize the tempo, bend it to its will, and force Russia to respond rather than act freely. This change of rhythm resonates deeply in military history. Turning tides are rarely about one battle alone, but about the cumulative effect of momentum changing hands. The strike against the port was a signal to soldiers in the trenches, to commanders in their operations centers, and to civilians enduring the hardship of war that their struggle was not in vain, that they could believe in victory rather than just survival. For the Russian side, it was the opposite, a reminder that their power could be punctured, that their resources could be wasted, and that their future victories were not guaranteed. The course of war is as much about perception as it is about destruction. Each image of burning ships, each report of shattered infrastructure, amplified the sense that Ukraine had crossed into a new phase of the conflict. No longer simply resisting, they were reshaping, recalibrating the balance of power in ways Moscow had not prepared for. The turning tide meant more than the loss of ships. It meant the loss of confidence, the loss of momentum, and the loss of narrative control. When these are taken from an opponent, the material losses are multiplied in significance. Ukraine's precision strike at the port exemplified the essence of a turning tide, the moment when initiative shifts, when strength is redefined, and when the story of a conflict begins to tilt in a new direction. It was not just the destruction of a fleet or a facility, but the emergence of a signal that Ukraine held the power to dictate future events, that they had the tools, the strategy, and the resilience to change the war's course. Every turning tide in history has begun with a moment like this, where a single strike transforms perception, momentum, and the balance of power all at once.